Thank you for all logging in today to hear this talk. My name is Richard Philpot, and I am a research fellow in the psychology department here at Lancaster University. And today I'm going to talk about the unhelpful bystander, ? So I'm going to start by just sort of setting out the definition, because bystander can mean different things to different fields. But essentially, we have an image here of someone being attacked, and there are lots of people in white here who are observing the incident, and these people are bystanders. They potentially can intervene, or they can continue to stand there as side witnesses. So I'm going to be talking about a body of research which is looking at bystander behaviour, and we've started looking at exactly, well, what is the likelihood that people, bystanders like this, that they might intervene to help, and what is the likelihood that they might actually be hurt when doing so. And this research is it's a body of work which is in collaboration with some good folks at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and also the NSCR in the Netherlands. So let's just start off by talking about what do we know about bystander reactions in public emergencies. Well, from the 1960s onwards, there's been a bit of moral concern that we might be living in a sort of walk-on-by society. The idea that this rise of urban living, of coming together in these sort of urban sprawling mass, that this is leading to a stranger culture in which people no longer feel collective responsibility for one another. Okay, by being together in these large groups, it helps to facilitate anonymity and a lack of accountability. So it could be that we're walking, we're navigating through our public spaces, and we see something that's a bit iffy, but we think, well, it's not really my concern, or I just need to get from A to B, or you know, I'm in my own little bubble. And this has led to ideas about urban norms of non-involvement, so that people are largely apathetic to the plight of others. And I'm sure that many of you can recall instances in the media in which somebody really needed bystander help. So maybe it's a public assault. So someone is assaulted and people see it, and someone is crying out for help, but actually nobody steps in. In social psychology, the most famous case here is Kitty Genovese. And in 1964, she was walking home from work late at night, and she was being stalked, and she was brutally assaulted and killed. And apparently 38 witnesses observed this, and they failed to act. Okay, and now there's a lot of evidence that actually a lot of that case is more fiction than fact, and that people might have done more than what we generally assume. But this kind of encapsulates the fear that we have that we might need some help in public space, and that people would be too hesitant to do anything. So this typically in social psychology has been summed up by the bystander effect. And the bystander effect is the idea that by myself, I might be willing to intervene, but when I'm surrounded by other people, I feel inhibited to do so, because people are watching me and I'm embarrassed, so I've got some audience inhibition. Or maybe there's lots of other people, why is no one else stepping up? Why should it be me? Or maybe someone else here is better skilled or better able to handle it than me. And all of this works to inhibit my helping intention, and in the end, it can be that the victim just doesn't receive help at all. But where do we get most of our ideas about bystander behaviour? Well, most of it actually comes from laboratory experiments. So what we do as psychologists is we invite participants into the lab. We then have confederates who are actors, who might feign an injury or fall over or drop something of value. And what we do is we record what the participant does. So does the participant help more often when they're by themselves, or do they help more often when they are in a crowd with other people? And what we generally find is a bystander effect, in which people are less likely to help when there are other people, when there's an audience. And the experiments are really handy because they allow us to test different experimental situations. So we can set up different emergencies. We can keep these constant across participants, so we've got some experimental control, and we can make little tweaks and changes so we can figure out exactly which of these changes is impacting helping behaviour. So that's really useful. But there are limitations. So by bringing people into the lab or by setting up field experiments, we need to decontextualise the emergency. We want to standardise it over conditions, so we strip it back and we keep it as clean as possible so that noise doesn't interfere with our results. Also, we're not able to simulate actual danger or harm for very good ethical reasons. So you cannot put a participant in a situation where they might actually be physically hurt. And in these experiments, Typically, the audience is one other individual, or at most maybe a handful of individuals who are told not to intervene. So then if you want to extrapolate this back to the Kitty Genovese incident, you have to ask what is the degree of realism here, where we've got instances where there are no real costs, people actually can't be hurt, and in populated settings, there are typically a lot of people, not one or a handful. So I'll leave that as food for thought. Another thing we can do is we can ask people about their experiences. So we can bring people into the lab and we can ask them to write about their previous experiences of public emergencies or public assaults. We can ask them to do vignette studies in which we say, imagine that this happens, what would you do? Or we can use police case files, we can use media reports in which we have narratives from witnesses who were there. And this data is really rich in descriptive detail. And we get a lot of insights into people's motivations, like their feelings and their experiences. But we know that what people say they do and what they actually do, they're not necessarily the same things. There can be limitations with memory failure and social desirability biases where you want to put yourself in the best light. And if you're interested in looking at, for example, media reports or police interview data, what you'll be doing is you'll be oversampling the situations which potentially were really severe because it became of interest to the police, because it was recorded in the media. So the instances in which people did intervene and actually it was resolved peacefully, that will not be in this sample. So where are we now with the idea of the bystander effect? Well, in popular media and in most undergraduate psychology textbooks, the message is because there are so many people in populated settings, people are getting inhibited and victims are rarely helped. But this is at odds with the idea of a mechanical helping potential. And the mechanical helping potential is, yes, it could be that there are more people and this inhibits me and I feel embarrassed to intervene. But by simply having more people, it provides a wider pool from which someone will step up to do something. And for the victim, that's the most important thing. So if I'm in an argument that escalates, or if someone assaults me, I want to know, well, will someone help me, regardless of how many people are around? There's also evidence in the last decade or so that the bystander effect may not hold for dangerous emergencies. So back in the 60s, before ethical applications got a bit more stringent, and rightfully so, people did try to simulate experiments with sort of fake attacks and things like this. And what they found from reviewing the old literature was that in these situations, you were probably more likely to intervene when there are more people present because it provided a resource. You felt supported. You didn't feel alone in getting involved. But if I'm a member of the public, and I want to know, well, how likely is it that I will be helped in these situations? And the truth is we just don't know because we can't actually use experimental data to answer this, and we can't use bias samples with self-report because it's more towards severe cases. So today's theme is change. So I'm going to talk about a change in methodology, which has meant that we've been able to leave the lab and look at this work a different way, and how this can change our understanding and potentially then the recommendations that we can make for people. So what is this methodological change? Well, the methodological change is public surveillance, public security cameras. So it might surprise you to know that currently there are 1.5 million local and national government-owned CCTV cameras covering our public squares, covering our sort of urban areas, covering our transport stations and our major retail parks. And the idea here is they can be a really useful crime preventative resource for some crimes. They're really useful for helping to identify offenders and to bring them to justice. So naturally, we've got quite an omnipresent full coverage in the UK now. And the average Londoner is actually captured on camera 300 times a day. And not only can this be used as a crime preventative resource, but potentially this is an extremely important digital data source, which allows us to see what is happening in these real life public events. So I've got quite a heavily pixelated picture here for obvious ethical reasons, but is it the case that when there's an assault, like you can probably see on the bottom right here, there's a man in a white shirt who's pinning someone down and attacking them. Is it the case that people stand there with their hands in their pockets or folding their arms and not doing anything at all? And this is what we wanted to know in our research group. So we carried out a study and our first research question, well, was what is the likelihood that a victim of a public argument, a heated argument, or of a public assault and everything from animated arguments all to really severe violence. What is the likelihood that someone steps in and tries to de-escalate the fight? We also wanted to know whether the size of the audience would have an impact. So are you more likely to receive help as a victim in an assault when there are more people, or are you less likely? And we wanted to know whether there's a difference in national context, because we're fortunate to have data from 3 different countries. So we had 219 CCTV clips of public conflicts, and these were sourced from the UK, from Netherlands, and from South Africa. And the CCTV data, it covered like public streets, it covered shop front and entertainment districts and parks and transport exteriors. So what we did was we had a team of research assistants, and they started by observing the videos and finding where the conflicts occurred. So where did the fight happen? Where did the argument happen? Where did the assault take place? They then counted the number of witnesses, the number of people present captured on camera. And they then recorded the number of people who tried to enter and break up the fight, people who tried to separate the conflict parties, to pull the aggressor away, to try and placate those who were involved in the fight. And we also recorded the national context. And what did we find? Well, I've taught this a lot, and I presented this to social psychologists, and I've asked them for estimates, and 5% is an estimate I frequently get. So social psychologists who teach the bystander effect, they suggest that maybe in 5% of these instances, someone will do something to help. I've had estimates of 10%, even as high as 25%. So some people have said maybe a quarter of the time, the member of the public will stand up and intervene. But what we found was in 9 out of 10 conflicts, so 91%, at least someone did something to try and placate the situation. And we found that the more people that were present, the greater the likelihood that someone would help. So this is the mechanical helping potential. The idea that you would rather there be more people, because it might create a bystander effect, which inhibits me from intervening, but it also creates a pool in which someone will step in. But it isn't just someone. What we find is, on average, it's 3.7, 3.8 people who are intervening. So people are cooperating, they're coordinating. And this is in line with some evidence from a study by Mark Levine and colleagues who looked at CCTV fights in public places. And they found that the most peaceful resolutions were when multiple people cooperated and coordinated together to bring resolution. Okay, so it isn't necessarily the case that people just stand there with their hands in their pockets, or maybe they do while they initially process, but when it really counts, what happens is people step in and they pull away the aggressors, they stand between the conflict parties and they try to help. So this, of course, is good news. It's nice to know. But the next question is, well, should we be recommending that people intervene? Is it dangerous to do so? Will the fight turn on me if I take the step of entering the fray? So again, we looked at this with some CCTV data. So we wanted to know, what is the likelihood that someone who intervenes to break up a fight, that they are then hit or kicked or thrown to the floor or stomped on? And we wanted to know what are the risk factors associated with these victimizations. So we had 93 clips of public conflicts again, and we captured 337 interveners. So again, a lot of people were active and intervening. And we found 636, it was a subgroup, so it was a control group of people who were present but didn't intervene. So they stood and they watched, but they didn't actively get involved. And we started off again by identifying the conflicts. And then we wanted to know, okay, so of the people who intervened and the people who didn't, how many of them did the fight get turned on them? And what we found is, of the 337 intervening bystanders, only 12 people were physically victimized, which is a rate of 3.6%. For non-interveners, so people who stood at the sides but didn't physically get involved, it was significantly lower. So they were extremely safe, nearly none of them got victimized. However, they're probably not having the same impact as people who are trying to separate the conflict, as we saw before. But also interesting to know is that most people were not heavily victimized. So 50% were hit once, 42% were shoved or pushed away. We found no examples of severe violence. So nobody was stomped or kicked on the floor or attacked with a weapon. And of course, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. I'm absolutely certain there are cases in which people have intervened and they've been seriously hurt. But what we can say is, from these 93 clips, it isn't in our data. So we can assume it is a rare event, and maybe that is potentially why it attracts so much attention when it happens. Okay, so a change in methodology has led to a change in our understanding, but this also has an impact on recommendations that we can make. Firstly, there are implications for the field. So of course, it's reassuring for members of the public because we're revealing a more positive side of human nature. But it's also nice because it helps to reframe the narrative. So we can reframe bystander from someone who's just like a passive onlooker to someone who potentially is an active peacekeeper. And also we can start reframing the question of, well, why don't they help? Why does no one help? And we can change this to, well, actually people are helping a lot. So the real question is, when is intervention successful and when does it unfortunately fail? Lastly, there are some implications for crime prevention councils and for the police. So for the police, bystanders are very useful because they can be witnesses. They can be people who observe these sort of conflicts in public space happening. And then they can help with identifying culprits or with standing up in court to testify. But what we're saying to the police is actually bystanders should be considered as zero responders. So these are people who are providing informal help before the arrival of the first responders, the police. And then also for crime prevention councils, there are some important implications. So I've done a lot of time reviewing what recommendations are made for bystanders. And to be honest, there really isn't a strong empirical base. We don't really know until recently what it is that, so how many people intervene? How likely is it you get hurt? We didn't know. So what the recommendations were for bystanders was, well, make yourself known, because the presence of you by its very self might deter the culprit. However, don't enter the fray because you might make it worse. You might get hurt. But what we're finding here is, well, actually, people are intervening all the time. So you don't need to tell people to do it or not to do it. People are doing it. We find the risk is generally pretty low. And from accumulating evidence in the CCTV field, we're finding that people typically don't make it worse. They make it better. So we're able to provide an empirical evidence base which can be used to change recommendations. And lastly, this research is quite handy for urban planning theory. So it suggests there is a safety in numbers. So we should be designing our public spaces so we can facilitate people traffic, so that when these incidents occur, when arguments happen, when things get out of hand, or when there's an assault, that we've got people who, a big pool of people from which someone might step in and try and make a positive impact. So I'll just stop there. I'll just say thank you very much to the research group here in Lancaster, Social Processes Group, and also the Video Violence Group in the University of Copenhagen. I'd like to thank my publication collaborators and also the Video Analysis Lab, who spent a lot of time working with this video data to make this possible. So thank you very much.